Hello, Bermuda, and welcome once again to our latest edition of This Week in Government. I'm your host, Tarai Trott. First in the studio today, we have the Minister of Economy and Labor, the Honorable Jason Hayward. Later, we'll be talking to Labor Relations Manager Gabrielle Can from the Department of Labor. Both guests will discuss important initiatives in their ministry. Welcome, Minister Hayward. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tarai.
Minister, a national minimum hourly wage was recently enacted. And for those who have not been following the news and keeping up to date with what's been going on, can you explain what is a minimum hourly rate?
So a minimum wage rate is a floor in which no employer can pay an employee below. And so what it does is it actually sets up a minimum remuneration across the board within our society.
Can you tell us the thinking behind the motivation for this? Why did the government feel that this was a priority?
And so when you look at the Labour government's ethos, it's centered around social justice. So we wanted to ensure that we implement some sort of statutory minimum remuneration rate that prevents the exploitation of workers, improves the purchasing power of families, but provides some sort of decent level of payment for a decent day's work for employees.
And for the sake of our audience, when did this minimum rate come into effect?
So the minimum wage rate of $16.40 came into effect on June 1, 2023.
There's an issue, Minister, of what's referred to as hybrid pay structure. Can you explain to us how this works?
So across the board, all employees must receive $16.40. However, in certain sectors, such as hospitality with hotels and restaurants, we recognize that a large portion of their income or remuneration was actually derived from service charges and gratuities, and not by the wages which are actually paid by employers. As a result of that, and in alignment with the recommendation from the Wage Commission, we looked at that matter and says that their minimum wage can be a combination between the base wage in which an employer provides and the gratuities and service charge they receive. The two have to add up to $16.40. If gratuities and service charges are not enough to move an employee's salary up to $16.40, then the employer is responsible for ensuring that that employee gets $16.40. That is the same that when we looked into the area of personal services workers, such as barbers, nail technicians, and those that work in beautician services. A large portion of their remuneration was based off commission. And as a result of that, we've allowed commission also to be factored in to that minimum wage rate of $16.40. However, like with hospitality workers, if the commission received does not equate to $16.40, it is the employer's responsibility to top that up.
Minister, can you give us some rationale, or some insight into the rationale that was used to determine this particular figure of $16.40? I have seen, I'm sure you have too, some people who have written that perhaps they would have liked that figure to be much higher.
Yes, certainly. Many have said that $16.40 is too low. Others say that $16.40 is too high. We believe that $16.40 is the appropriate first step and lays a good foundation for the entire minimum wage framework. When we looked at what the Wage Commission had placed within their report as a recommendation, they recommended that what would be economically palatable for our economy is a minimum wage between $15 and $18. As a result of that, we then looked at their recommendation. We made an inflation adjustment to the recommendation and came up with a figure of $16.40 for the initial minimum wage rate. I would like to say that that minimum wage rate is one of the highest minimum wage rates in the world.
And speaking about that rate, the $16.40, a technical question, is it net or gross, and what's the difference?
So it's a gross. It means that the $16 is before deductions. And so when you look at one's pay, you do the $16.40 times the number of hours that one would work to get to the gross remuneration, and then you can make deductions from that particular figure.
You're bound to get people, Minister, who will say that given the state of the economy, given the state of business due to the recent or the pandemic, that now is not the right time to be implementing such a wage, and this perhaps could wait till another time. What do you say to that?
I believe it's always the right time to do the right thing. I don't support the notion that our economy can't absorb a $16.40 minimum wage rate. Our economy is extremely robust right now. We have, if you look at the economic indicators, we have significant economic activity, positive economic activity in a number of industrial sections. We see the wages of employees continue to increase. The preliminary data we have, we've seen a genuine rebound in the number of workers within Bermuda. So we continue to see an expansion of workers. And this is even after the implementation of the $16.40 minimum wage. And so I don't see it having a negative impact on employment. The other thing is that when we look at a business's economic model, no business should have a business model that is predicated on paying a worker what we call exploitation wages or starvation wages. And so, as a government was saying, that is unacceptable for our society, and we stand firm behind the $16.40 minimum wage.
And speaking about the state of the economy, are you able to give us any assessment on levels of employment?
We had the level of employment from the last survey, which indicated that we had hundreds of additional employees within the population. I'm currently waiting on the labor force statistics numbers. We had a labor force survey that was run in February. That will give us a firm understanding of what our current unemployment rate is and how much we've actually progressed. But if I look at payroll tax data from the Ministry of Finance, it would indicate that employers are paying payroll tax for over 1,000 more employees than they did in the same quarter of the previous year, which would indicate to us that there has been significant progress in terms of the country's employment levels.
As we have this discussion, I'm curious, is it possible, Minister, for an employer, or rather an employee, to sign something, let's say they're incentivized by their employer to say that they want to opt out of the minimum wage structure? Is that possible?
No, it is not possible. There is no provisions that would allow employee and an employer to engage in a contractual agreement which finds that employee getting remunerated below the statutory minimum wage rate.
The law is the law in this case.
Correct.
Minister, if I can go to another subject, and that is perhaps inflation. That's another concern some might have. Why now this rate in the face of the current levels of inflation?
The level of inflation that we've experienced is a problem globally. And when we look at either the monetary policy, the fiscal policy, or even the labor policy that governments around the world are implementing, and what is even recommended by the ILO, what you see is progression of minimum wage rates across the world. We didn't have a minimum wage rate to progress. And so the instituting a minimum wage rate puts us in perfect alignment with 90% of ILO countries around the world. And it puts us in extremely good company. I was recently in Guyana at a Caribbean labor ministers meeting. And when the countries were discussing their issues as it pertains to inflation and some of the other challenges that we had. And the responses to those particular challenges, a number of countries were looking at either implementing a minimum wage rate or progressing a minimum wage, their current minimum wage rates. And so this is a policy response to ensure that we improve the purchasing power of households and individuals within our society.
I should have asked you this a bit earlier, but I'll go back to it, and that is to invite you to respond to business owners who may feel that now's not the right time. Their business may be adversely impacted because of this requirement.
It's unfortunate if a business model is drastically impacted by a $16.40 minimum wage. And it would cause us to maybe put us back to the business, whether or not the business model is suited for our society.
Minister, I'm curious as to the feedback you've received, the ministry has received since this came into effect from stakeholders, ordinary members of the public.
Generally positive feedback, and if you listen to what persons are saying, they're supportive of having, across the board, their support for some sort of minimum wage rate in Bermuda. There's a lot of chatter, like you indicated, that some would like to see a higher minimum wage. There are small pockets of the business community that may have a concern with instituting the minimum wage, but the members that we've had stakeholder feedback and consultation with, they are generally supportive of statutory minimum wage rate. I haven't heard anybody publicly come out and say that a minimum wage rate is a bad thing for Bermuda.
We have less than a minute remaining, Minister. Any closing words, final thoughts on this subject?
Yes, certainly. This government is committed to ensuring that we progress the lives of the residents within this country. You will see that not only are we ensuring that we move forward with effective labor law and labor policy, we are also expanding social protections within our society so that we strengthen social safety nets across the board. We will continue with having a human-centered approach to the way in which we move forward with policy implementation in Bermuda.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Minister, for your time today on this very important subject.
Thanks for having me, Tarai.
And thank you, Minister Hayward, for joining us today. Right after the break, we'll be continuing this discussion with Labor Relations Manager Gabrielle Cam.
Hello, Bermuda. Hurricane season is currently underway, and as National Security Minister, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of being ready. This year, forecasters estimate a 40% chance of a near normal season and a 30% chance of a below normal season. But as I have always said, vigilance is key. The government, through the Emergency Measures Organization, is prepared and ready should the need arise. In the event of a serious weather disturbance, please monitor the Bermuda Weather Service and our Government of Bermuda social media channels for all official advisories. Remember to tune in to the emergency radio station during a storm on 100.1 FM or via the new audio stream at the bottom of the gov.bm portal. For tips or for more information on hurricane readiness, visit gov.bm. Bermuda, I thank you in advance for making the necessary preparations, and may we approach this season with cooperation and unity.
As we get started, I want to invite you to explain to us exactly who will benefit from this minimum wage.
Yeah, absolutely. So persons who are considered employees and entitled to receive the minimum hourly wage are persons who are wholly or mainly employed in Bermuda for remuneration under a contract of employment, persons who perform services wholly or mainly in Bermuda for other persons for remuneration, and their employment relationship more closely resembles that of an employee as opposed to an independent contractor. A casual worker, a temporary employee, a part-time employee, and a student. And those who are not considered employees and are not entitled to receive the minimum hourly wage are persons who are under the age of 18, a grocery packer, a voluntary worker, a person who is employed as an apprentice for the first 12 months of their training contract, and that training contract should be registered with the appropriate government department. And at this time, I believe that's the Department of Workforce Development. And also persons employed within a family business who are the immediate family member of the proprietor or the owner of the business.
You're bound to have employees who will feel that they are not being paid the new minimum rate. What recourse do they have?
Well, everyone, as I listed previously, who is entitled to receive the minimum hourly wage rate, has the right to request their employment records. The first thing that they can do is contact their employer and request that the employer produce their records, and this is called a production notice. And the production notice should be in writing. It should state the time frame in question, and it should also state whether or not the individual is exercising their right by themselves or with the assistance of someone else, say an attorney or another representative. The employer then has 14 days to provide them with their records for their review. Once they've had an opportunity to review their records, if they still feel that they're not being correctly remunerated, then they can contact an inspector at the Department of Labor, who will then begin an investigation into the alleged breach.
Now, having a minimum hourly wage is great, but how are you going to enforce it?
So the Employment Minimum Hourly Wage Entitlement Act 2022 is a legislation responsible for the enforcement of the minimum hourly wage. Under this legislation, we have labor inspectors who have the ability to issue enforcement notices, make awards, and also issue civil penalties. If an inspector finds that an employer is paying their employee or a group of employees less than the minimum hourly wage rate, the inspector can issue an enforcement notice, and this enforcement notice will require the employer to provide the difference between the current rate of pay and the minimum hourly rate. Additionally, the inspector can issue an award, which is 10% of the minimum hourly wage rate, and that should be paid to the employee for each pay reference period that the employer has not correctly remunerated them. Additionally, if the inspector finds that the employer is not keeping the correct records or is not adhered to an enforcement notice, then the inspector can issue the employer with a penalty notice, which will then require them to pay a civil penalty.
Where can employees and employers go to get additional information on the minimum wage?
So the Ministry of Economy and Labor's page on the government's website, which is gov.bm, has a lot of important information posted there. Additionally, we encourage everyone, employers, employees, their respective representatives, the general public, to read and familiarize themselves with the legislation. And the legislation can be found on Bermuda Law's website, which is bermudalaws.bm. What they should be looking for is the Employment Wage Commission Act 2019, and this establishes the Wage Commission and also sets out who is entitled to receive a minimum wage. They should also be looking for the Employment Minimum Hourly Wage Entitlement Act 2022. This sets out the application and the enforcement of the minimum hourly wage. The Employment Minimum Hourly Wage Entitlement Regulations 2023. This regulation accompanies the Act, and it specifies in a bit more detail what some of the provisions are meant to do. And lastly, the Employment Minimum Hourly Wage Order 2023 specifies in detail what the minimum hourly wage rate is. Additionally, persons can contact the Department of Labor and they can speak to us confidentially. We'll give them labor advice on what their obligations, rights, and entitlements are under the Bermuda Labor Code, as well as the wage legislation. And you can contact us via phone on 297-7716. You can reach us via email at departmentoflabor@gov.bm, or you can just come into our offices. We're located at 23 Parliament Street in Housing.
Now, despite this implementation, I understand there are reports of employees who are already saying that their employers are not paying them the new minimum rate. Can you confirm this?
Yes, I can. We have received some reports since the implementation of the minimum hourly wage rate that there are some employers who are not adhering to the legislation. What our office does is, one, advises the employee of what their rights are, as I mentioned before, the production notice, the right to request their documents, have a look at them, and if they still feel that they're not being correctly remunerated, then they can contact us and we'll open an investigation. Also, once that information has been provided, then we will contact the employer and have a conversation with them to advise that we understand that they're not adhering to the legislation and help them to ensure that they're in compliance.
Looking at this initiative on a whole, for those employees who were previously earning below the 1640 rate, and now that they can earn at least 1640, it's bound to be welcome news for them, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. We have spoken and have seen employees in the past that were making $7, $8 an hour now move up to 1640. Especially in those industries where they don't receive gratuities or service charges or even commissions. We've seen individuals go home with a paycheck that doesn't have anything in it, unfortunately. So the setting of the minimum hourly wage is welcome news for those employees.
I know you touched on this earlier, but I want to stress that because I've heard reports of people who may have concerns about their wage, who may be fearful of speaking out because they may be on a work permit, etc., that their employer may find out if they reach out to you. But as you said, any contact with your office is kept in confidence.
Yes, absolutely. You can contact us anonymously if you'd like. You can come in and you can have a confidential conversation with us. We will not contact your employer without your permission.
And there is a perception that perhaps the people who were not being adequately paid previously were people on work permits, but that's not true, is it?
No.
You had Bermudians who were not being paid that rate.
Yes, absolutely. Bermudians and work permit holders alike were being paid less than that rate, yes.
I'm curious, do you have people who are reluctant to make a complaint about their wages or to ask questions with your office? Is that a thing?
Yes, that was a challenge for us in the past. And what we've done is we've released a guide to working in Bermuda that explains to the general public who we are, what we do, where they can go if they have any questions. It's basically a summary of the Employment Act, so it outlines what everyone's rights and obligations are under the legislation. We also produced a independent contractors guidance booklet as well. So for those individuals who were unsure of their employment status, whether they were an employee or an independent contractor, they were able to have a look at that, and if they had any questions, then they can come directly to us. So the guidance booklet, the independent contractors guidance, and just generally, the information is there at our office, not only for employees, but also for employers if they have any concerns with regards to ensuring that they're paying the minimum hourly wage in accordance with the legislation, as well as the respective representatives of the employers as well as employees.
I know you've been very clear, but for the avoidance of doubt for those watching, that this minimum wage also applies to people who are contract workers and who are part-time workers.
Yes, absolutely. It applies to all of those individuals that I listed at the very beginning. Yes.
Under the legislation, can you explain what an employer can do if they do not agree with an enforcement notice or civil penalty that they may have received?
Yep, absolutely. If an employer is not in agreement with the decision of the inspector, then they can appeal to the Employment and Labor Relations Tribunal. They should do so in accordance with the timeframes that are set out in the Act. If they are aggrieved by the decision of that tribunal, then they have the ability to appeal to the Supreme Court on any point of law.
Well, thank you very much, Gabrielle Can, for this insightful conversation today. I really appreciate it.
Yes, and thank you very much for having me. I hope that this information has been beneficial to your listening public.
We've been chatting with the Economy and Labor Minister Jason Hayward and Labor Relations Manager Gabrielle Can. You've been watching the latest episode of This Week in Government. I'm Tarai Trott. Thank you for watching.